major victory for the Standing Rock Sioux tribe.
Cerca de la reserva de la tribu Sioux, that an oil pipeline's planned route along the Standing Rock Sioux reservation has been denied.
President-elect Trump has said he supports that project, and some experts believe he could reverse the decision.
Hello, I'm Richard Gisbert, and you're at the Listening Post. Here are some of the media stories we're covering this week. Access pipeline denied. The protesters in North Dakota get some traction and some coverage at last. An American media watchdog swings its lens away from Fox News and onto media outlets on the alt-right. Baku cracks down again. Journalists arrested, websites blocked in Azerbaijan. And Benjamin Netanyahu and the Israeli news media. It's a battle for control, and journalists there are using some of the Prime Minister's words against him. It was described as the longest-running protest in modern American history, although you would not have known that from the scant media coverage, and it eventually made a difference. An oil pipeline through the U.S. Midwest will be rerouted, and a group of Native American tribes, backed by thousands of supporters, have succeeded, for now, in protecting their water supply and some sacred burial grounds. The turnaround, both the decision and the increased media interest thereafter, exposed just how poorly this story had been covered until that point. There were some logistical challenges. The protest camp is a long way from the media centers on both coasts, but the lack of coverage went much deeper than that, reflecting at least two institutional biases in the U.S. news media against environmental issues as well as stories about Native Americans. However, a recent pair of events changed the entire story arc. Both involved another institution the media tend to treat more favorably, the U.S. military. The first was a show of support, solidarity from veterans, men and women who had spent time in uniform. Then the U.S. Army's Corps of Engineers, for environmental reasons, denied the construction company permission to route the Dakota Access Pipeline through a lake. This is a multi-layered story, and when you peel away some of those layers, it's a case study on the kinds of issues where the American news media frequently fall short. Our starting point this week is the Standing Rock Indian Reservation in North Dakota. North Dakota is what Americans call a flyover state, visible to travelers from the air, but seldom does it get on the air, a black hole in the U.S. news landscape. That changed this past week with the decision to reroute a pipeline that will stretch from North Dakota to Illinois. But prior to that, a protest led by thousands of Native Americans that had been running for more than 6 months went largely unseen in the mainstream news media.
The New York Times, CNN, and Fox News just weren't on the ground early enough. This comes down to mainstream media not being accountable to marginalized groups and not doing the type of local reporting that's so critical to the health of journalism as an institution.
It is astounding how little coverage they have gotten over these months. But this very much goes in lockstep with a lack of coverage of climate change. Add to it a group of people who are marginalized by the corporate media, Native Americans, and you have a combination that vanishes them. And yet these protests have only intensified. The resistance camps have only grown over the months without the media megaphone of the corporate media.
The way that Indians make news is through something called the WD4 rule.
There is singing, there is dancing. Everybody here is so happy.
Which is they have to be warriors, drunks, dying, dancing, or drumming. And I think a lot of coverage is focused on stories that open up with protesters out there drumming or dancing or singing.
Drumbeats, cheers, and tears.
I think a lot of that might stem from stereotypes.
When you have peaceful water protectors marching up a rural road, and they are met with water cannons, they're met with rubber bullets, it is absolutely critical that journalists not be afraid to be there, to show what's happening, to go to where the silence is.
The logistical challenges of covering this story have been enormous. The closest airport is 1 hour away from the camps at Cannonball. The weather has grown worse as winter moved in to the upper Midwest. The independent journalists who went in to cover over social media what major news outlets were initially ignoring could not even count on a steady Wi-Fi connection, congregating on what came to be known as Facebook Hill, hoping to get a signal. The first in, though, were the locals, indigenous media organizations that focus on native issues, and news outlets from North Dakota covering their own backyard. Journalists late to the story arrived to find few hotels to accommodate them or restaurants to feed them. That lack of basic infrastructure left many sleeping in their cars.
This is happening about an hour south of Bismarck, North Dakota, but once you arrive in Bismarck, you have to drive through some very snowy roads to get to this protest site. We've gone through a blizzard then and then another blizzard this week, and that can be kind of complicated. It's also very expensive for news organizations to send reporters out here for an extended period of time to cover an issue like this.
The journalists who got there chronicled the treatment of activists by police and security guards. In one cruel twist, in a story largely about protecting lakes, rivers, and people from a potential pipeline catastrophe, sub-zero temperatures did not stop the authorities from drenching activists with water cannons. Tear gas was deployed, tasers as well. Some reporters turned into casualties. Stories. The woman behind this camera was hit by a police rubber bullet mid-interview. And a prominent national journalist ended up in court facing rioting charges that would eventually be dropped. All Amy Goodman of Democracy Now! Would plead guilty to was practicing journalism.
It was September 3rd. We were covering a group of Native Americans who came upon an excavation site, the Standing Rock Sioux, considered sacred.
The bulldozers are still going, and they're yelling at the men in hard hats.
And the people started demanding that the bulldozers stop. We were filming all of this, and the security guards unleashed dogs and pepper spray. We uploaded that video that evening.
Ma'am, your dog just bit this protester.
Within a few days, 14 million views. All the networks were playing this video footage of the savagery of the attacks. 5 days later, the governor called out the National Guard of North Dakota to take on the water protectors and issued an arrest warrant for me. I mean, this was ludicrous, an arrest warrant.
I've noticed in covering social movements over the years that some of the most egregious abuses of power happen when journalists aren't around. And that's also why journalism is so integral to a functioning democracy. But I think one of the biggest developments that's come out of Standing Rock is the quality of journalism being produced by people on the ground there.
The arrival of some 2,000 U.S. military veterans who came to support the tribal leaders and activists changed perceptions. Later that same day, the Army's Corps of Engineers changed everything, ordering the pipeline company to find another route. The activists who call themselves water protectors, who don't like it when the media describe them simply as protesters, have prevailed for now, and they have the backing of the White House for now. But they know Washington awaits a changing of the guard. The Trump administration could change everything again, and that their efforts over these past 6 months and the intervention of the veterans could all come to nothing.
The veterans coming to Standing Rock has captured the attention of the national media. There's a lot of reporters who have been here this past week to document the veterans' arrival. And so the conditions out at this camp in combination with the veterans coming, it's really kind of a crazy scene down there right now with so many people and such harsh conditions if you're out at the camps. And so I think that the media is really paying attention to that right now.
There's a lot of reasons to be depressed about journalism these days, especially in our collective failure to cover the campaign of Donald Trump. But what gives me hope is the quality of the stories that are coming out of these Indigenous-led publications and collectives of journalists.
The limited amount of coverage that was done on the Dakota Access Pipeline issue, at least awakened a lot of America to the fact that American Indians still exist and are still there and are still fighting the same battle that they've been fighting for the last few hundred years. What the media is missing right now is that this will happen again. This will happen somewhere else in the country, and because there's not a very particularly good grasp of what the issues and history are that made this particular incident happen, that they're going to miss it when it happens again.
On the download now, our viewers on the coverage of the Dakota Access Pipeline story.
Despite the size of the movement, the critical issues at stake, and the significant violent repression people faced, it wasn't until late October when a flurry of check-ins on social media drew the widespread attention of journalists. However, their coverage at the time focused on misguided social media slacktivism rather than addressing substantive issues.
Mostly white militarized police were attacking real natives over oil at Standing Rock, as the local media stirred hatred and the mainstream mostly ignored it. The majority of police, prosecutors, judges, the media heads are all white. In society and in news, they don't want anything or anyone who threatens that status quo to be shown. The indigenous-led movement at Standing Rock is doing just that.
Other media stories that are on our radar this week. The government of Azerbaijan has been busy recently, bringing the media there to heel. 3 journalists have been arrested, 2 leading news websites have been blocked, and there's a new law dealing with defamation. Late last month, independent journalists Afgan Sadiqov, the editor of website Azel.tv, Timur Karimov, a reporter at the Canal 13 website, and Zamin Gaji from the Yeni Musafat newspaper were all arrested by security forces. Both Sadiqov and Karimov were accused of aggravated assault after, they say, they were attacked by some unidentified individuals who then filed complaints against the journalists. Then the authorities in Baku blocked access to the U.S.-funded websites of Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, and Voice of America for a few days. The websites are popular with Azerbaijanis since they are amongst the few outlets still prepared to report critically on the government. The new online defamation law makes insulting the president on social media a criminal offense. Offenders using fake accounts could face fines and up to 3 years in jail. There are also penalties in place for those writing in their own name. Over the past few years, dozens of journalists in Azerbaijan have ended up behind bars for criticizing the government. Bahrain has denied access to a reporter from the Al Jazeera media network, blocking him from covering a summit meeting of the Gulf Cooperation Council, the GCC, in the country's capital, Manama. On the 6th of December, journalist Jamal Ashayel was refused entry at Bahrain International Airport for reasons yet unspecified.
Unfortunately, the authorities there prevented Al Jazeera from entering to cover this.
Al-Shayel said that Al Jazeera had applied for accreditation well in advance and followed all the necessary procedures. The Qatar-based network then issued a statement saying this wasn't the first time that Bahrain has denied reporters access without providing convincing reasons. The New York-based Committee to Protect Journalists said it did not have details on this particular incident, but it said Bahrain has jailed journalists, repeatedly cracked down on local and international coverage of protests, and banned international journalists from covering human rights abuses in the kingdom. Bahrain's information ministry has not returned repeated calls and emails seeking comment. One of the most prominent liberal media watchdogs in the U.S., Media Matters, says it's now shifting its focus. It will spend less time monitoring cable news and more time focusing on alt-right media outlets and fake news. Media Matters launched back in 2004. The site has since dedicated itself to scrutinizing Fox, calling it out for not being close to fair and balanced. But there's a new man at the helm, Angelo Carusone, and he says he wants a different approach. There was a period of time in which we were, rightfully so, described as Fox antagonists. Now our mission is to be principally focused on the value of journalism. The reorientation of Media Matters comes at a time when many have criticized the U.S. mainstream news media for enabling or not doing enough to prevent the spread of false news and misinformation in the run-up to the electoral victory of Donald Trump. For a country that calls itself the Middle East's only true democracy, the changing state of the media in Israel has become a cause for concern. Freedom House, an American NGO that ranks countries based on the state of their media, recently downgraded Israel's status from free to partly free. Part of its reasoning, it said, was Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's decision to take on the additional portfolio of Minister of communications. To say that Netanyahu has taken a hands-on approach with the Israeli news media is to sell his efforts short. He seems to want a new publicly owned television channel, which has been 2 years in the making, scrapped before its first broadcast. Netanyahu has also taken to writing long letters of complaint to individual journalists whose criticisms he cannot abide. The Prime Minister paints himself as a victim of a hostile press, even though the most widely read newspaper in the country constantly sings his praises, and it's bankrolled by an American billionaire who is happy to run that paper at a loss as long as it props up his man. The Listening Post's Will Young now from Tel Aviv on the Prime Minister who doubles as Israel's media watchdog.
September 2015. Benjamin Netanyahu cancels all interviews previously arranged with newspapers and TV stations and uploads a video to his social media accounts. The video was called Things You Won't Hear in the Media. Not trusting journalists to present him positively, Benjamin Netanyahu at times will simply bypass them, and at times will go to war.
Netanyahu found himself in a battlefield, which he was the target, and the snipers came from the media with cameras. Most of the journalists in Israel dislike him, and most of the media in Israel are not really favorite for Netanyahu. Since the media is not really objective, he thought that he might find ways to make it subjective, but for his purpose.
He's taken under his portfolio management the communication ministry, which is kind of strange because you would expect the prime minister to care more about security of the country or foreign affairs of the country. But apparently Netanyahu thinks that the most important issue is dealing with reporters.
The latest accusation to assail Netanyahu's government involves what may be large-scale corruption in a deal to purchase German submarines. The story was exposed by Raviv Drucker, who has long tormented the Prime Minister from the newsroom of Israel's privately owned Channel 10. Netanyahu has hit back at Drucker personally on Facebook. Defending Netanyahu are his colleagues in the right-wing Likud party, such as Yariv Levin.
Adam Yashar Hagun. Even now, I had a speech in the parliament about those allegations about the submarines. Next thing, when they didn't succeed in the bottom of the sea, probably will try and find some kind of a spaceship. Go back and see the faces of the journalists in the night of the elections. They weren't exactly celebrating.
Netanyahu is trying to change the game in a way that takes us far away from what a democracy should be. Look at the example of Channel 10, that for over a few years was held in a regulatory uncertainty, while the Prime Minister's office is pressuring Channel 10 to restrain criticism that was mainly heard by Raviv Drucker. So you see a Prime Minister leading a very personal battle against a private channel and a specific journalist just because he dares criticizing him.
And the same kind of uncertainty is affecting the public media too. Israel is currently awaiting the launch of a new public broadcaster to replace the existing authority whose appeal and credibility have long been in question. But though the new channel was planned by one of Netanyahu's ministers in 2014, the PM and his allies have in recent weeks launched attacks that threaten to strangle it at birth.
What should have been a public and very open broadcasting authority is becoming more and more, again, one-sided, with people, especially in the management and in the places that they can influence the overall content in a way that we are receiving something that is even worse than what we have now.
This whole body is already in the process of starting to broadcast and recruiting journalists. And all of a sudden, Netanyahu, at this dramatic moment, is trying to interrupt that. The aim is to maintain political power over the public media. So the public media does not belong to the public, it belongs to the Prime Minister.
In Israel's print media, Netanyahu, known to both friends and enemies as Bibi, already has the upper hand. In 2007, a new daily newspaper came to town, Israel Hayom, whose owner, US billionaire Sheldon Adelson, is a staunch Netanyahu supporter and is rich enough to keep the free newspaper afloat despite losses of an estimated $3 million a month. Israel Hayom, which now has nearly 40% of Israel's shrinking newspaper market, is commonly derided as Bibiton, or Bibi's paper, since critics see in it an obvious pro-Netanyahu bias. Israel Hayom's closest rival, Yediot Ahronot, used to be so successful that it was officially declared a monopoly. Now it's fighting to catch up. Igal Sarna is a columnist for Yediot. He himself has been sued by Netanyahu for posts on Facebook.
Of course, my newspaper was the biggest, but there was a competition. There was Haaretz, there was other newspapers, there was Ma'ariv, and now there is only one that doesn't act according to normal rules. When you look at this paper, you think that Bibi is the editor. A huge newspaper with a huge amount of money to lose, and the other newspaper has to fight for their lives. And it's a disaster for the press.
We had a bully in the neighborhood, Yediot Ahronot. Netanyahu just brought a bigger bully to the neighborhood, a stronger one. Israel Hayom is surely not a newspaper. It employs journalists, it calls itself a newspaper, but it doesn't follow any of the rules of the profession as we know it.
Even with Israel's largest circulation daily newspaper firmly on his side, Benjamin Netanyahu portrays himself as a man under attack, a man whose achievements go unrecognized, and even whose wife is not spared the barbs of biased journalists. So is it a paradox that arguably the most powerful man in Israeli politics sees himself as the victim of a hostile press? Or is it a political calculation?
Even the Prime Minister has the right to criticize the press, which I just did.
It's very easy for right-wing politicians here or elsewhere in the world to treat the media as biased to the left. You need a constant enemy. It used to be the Iranian threat.
A red line should be drawn right here.
Or maybe the Palestinian threat. I think overall in Netanyahu's mind, the way to get voters into the polls is being in a constant fight with reporters.
Settlers and right-wing voters, low socioeconomic levels inside Israel, for many years felt that they have no voice in the Israeli media. They are watching journalists on TV that really do not represent them. They read newspapers with columns of journalists that don't really talk to them. For Netanyahu, it's half strategy and half obsession. He will blame the media for many things. Part of them are true, part of them are not. At the end of the day, there is a mix between his own passion and between his deep understanding that the media is a good tool for elections.
Finally, Prime Minister Netanyahu really does take bad press to heart. And when an investigative reporter from Israel's Channel 2, Ilana Dayan, sent him a few questions about the inner workings of his office, he sent back a personal note, and it was no love letter, more like hate mail. Dayan then read the note on the air, all 6 minutes of it. And within days, a group of top Israeli journalists from both the left and the right showed where they stand on this kind of thing by recording their own version of the Prime Minister's letter and putting it online. We've cut it down, but you'll get the message. And we'll see you next time here at The Listening Post.
הגיע הזמן להסיר את המסכה מעל פניה של אילנה דיין, שהוכיחה פעם נוספת שאין לה אפילו טיפת יושרה מקצועית.
אילנה דיין היא בין המובילים של הקמפיין המתוזמר נגד ראש הממשלה בנימין נתניהו.
התוכנית של הערב אינה אלא תשדיר תעמולה פוליטי נגד ראש הממשלה ורעייתו, שכולו מחזור של רכילות מסולפת ושקרים מרושעים.
סקלת העיתונאית של אילנה דיין היא בעיקר מסווה של תעמולה פוליטית.
אילנה דיין היא אשת שמאל קיצוני. להתיישבות היהודית ביהודה ושומרון מתייחס דיין כאל גזל קרקעות. בעיתון הקיצוני הארץ, דיין מוצאת מקור של נחמה ושל שפיות.
הציבור הרחב איבד כבר מזמן כל אמון בגופי התקשורת המרכזיים שהתירו כל רסן בתעמולה שלהם נגד ראש הממשלה ונגד ממשלת הליכוד.
תוכניתה של דיין הערב מדגימה היטב מדוע שוק התקשורת חייב לעבור רפורמה.
ראש הממשלה נחוש לפתוח גם שוק זה לתחרות שתוסיף לגיוון וריבוי דעות לצד שידור ציבורי ממלכתי ויעיל.
גם אם אילנה דיין תמשיך את שידורי התעמולה שלה נגדו פעמיים בשבוע.